First of all, I'd like to just acknowledge the Wari people, the people of the whenua, the people of this land. I feel really, really humbled and privileged and a little bit whakamā, like a little bit shy, to be in like such great company, such esteemed company. I'd also like to thank Andrew for hosting me yesterday and looking after me. I'm one of those people, like when I get somewhere, I need to find someone, like I need to find a po or something solid from the place where I'm going to kind of help stabilise me, and that was Andrew yesterday, so thank you. And I want to mihi tū or acknowledge the other presenters today from Ngā Haui Whā, the four winds of our planet, for sharing your knowledge. It's really filled me up, and I also want to acknowledge Dee, my whanaunga from home. It's really, really good to see a Māori person. Like I've been away from home for like 6 weeks now, and I'm like the first Māori person I've had a conversation with since that, like in that time. So I'm really, really, well, a kanohi conversation, so kia ora. So who am I? My tribe are Te Arawa. My sub-tribe is Ngāti Whakaui. Our mountain is Ngōtaha, and my rivers are the Poerenga and the Utahina, and they flow into our Lake Rotorua, which my village is located on the shores of, my village Ohinemutu. My mother is of Welsh descent. My adopted mother is of Welsh descent, and my adopted father is Ngāti Whakaui, and all my siblings, all four of us, we're all adopted. And so what binds us to the place that we live in was my deceased father. On my birth side, my mountain is Tongariro, my river is Tokanu, and that flows past and through my marae Waihi, which is on the shores of Lake Taupo. And the weirdest thing for me, like a couple of years ago, was to visit Waihi marae for the first time and find out that it was exactly like Ohinemutu where I ended up. I don't think I know of another place on earth that is more like my village that I was adopted into than the village I was adopted from. It's a thermal village. Both my villages are thermal villages. And they both have an Anglican church and a Māori meeting house that face each other. And, I was going to say, don't worry about the tech, I'm just going to, no. They're like replicas. And so when I found out that the place that I came from was just like the place that I ended up, I was like, wow, things happen. There are circles and there are circles and there are circles. Actually, I think I am going to do the creative exercise. It's not hugely difficult. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play a video. I've got 5 videos that I want to play, and I've got 3 images that follow at the end. And what I'd like you to do is, the videos are about like 1.5 to 2 minutes long. It's just to watch the video. Some of them have audio, some of them don't. I'm not sure if the audio will play. Just while you're watching, if you could do 2 things for me. If you could write down what you think the work is about. And secondly, if you could write down a vision of hope that you think might be embedded in the work. And if you're okay with it, I would like to collect those at the end, and they will help inform my research. And also, if you're okay with it, I would be really, really appreciative if you could include your name so I can acknowledge you in my work. If not, if you don't want to include your name, that's fine. So, I mean, the fundamental question we all struggle with is who am I? Who am I in this world? And being adopted at birth, my entire life has been a question of, really, who am I? Because Māori people, we have a foundational concept called Whakapapa. And Whakapapa is like genealogy. It can be expressed as being like genealogy. And it's a framework that connects a person to other people, connects people to ideas, connects people to concepts, connects people to objects. It connects people to every other thing in the universe. But when you're brought up in a family where you know your father's whakapapa and how your father belongs, and the brief instance of where your mother belongs because her colonial upbringing has chopped off much of her ancestry, you spend a lot of time thinking about who you are. You know who they are, but you don't really know who you are. With my siblings, we knew where they came from. But with me, there had been a lot of secrecy around my birth. And so we didn't really know. And so from a really early age, I made up quite fantastical stories about who I was. And I used Māori stories to help me determine who I was. So in one of my stories, my birth father, he was an atua, or he was a god, or an alien. I like alien, actually. And he had come down and he had cohabitated with my mother. And when she realised she was pregnant, well, she freaked out. And so she went away to have me in secret. And she had me, and I ended up in this other place. So I'm a tranny, and that's what I'd figured out. I was like, well, what is it about being a tranny that I identify with? What is it about being in a transgendered space, or a space that is between what looks like concrete things? What is that space, and how do I fit into it? And thinking about it, I was like, well, what is my experience that has led me to feeling like I'm a transgendered person? And I started to think about my life and the stories that I told myself growing up. And I was like, actually, what's happened is that I've engaged with, like, I didn't know who I was, and then I did know who I was, and finding that out, like, I sought out death, and then in seeking out death, like, I found life, and I came back as a person who wasn't a boy anymore, but was maybe a girl, but in a boy's body. And I was like, what story is that like that? What story is like that? And it made me start thinking about my tupuna Māui. Because in our stories we have a trickster figure, like most cultures. We have a trickster, and his name was Maui, and he grew up with the same kinds of questions that I had. But Maui was like a demigod. Like he wasn't a god. He was part human as well, like kind of like Hercules, I suppose. And he did all these kinds of acts that helped teach Māori people about morality and about social structures, really, really important social structures. And when he had done all these deeds, he was like, you know what? There's something else. There's like death. What is this death thing? Like, can we stop death? And so in our stories, Maui was like, actually, I need to go to the source. I need to go to my primordial ancestress, Hinenui Te Po, who looks after the dead and empowers them, who empowers us. I need to go to her and try and take back the thing that she holds on to. I need to try and take back life. And so he thought and he thought and he thought. And eventually he realised that if we all come out of the womb, then maybe the way to reverse the life cycle was to climb back into the womb. And so that's what he tried to do. So he sought out Hinenui Te Po, climbed between her thighs, and tried to enter into her vagina. And in doing so, he woke her up. Like, there are different versions, but in one version, he woke her up. And so she crushed him between her thighs. that story made me wonder. It was like, well, like then what? Like, he was part God, so like maybe his human form died, but something else had to happen. And so for my PhD research, I started to conceptualise the space that comes after Maui, the trickster, toys with death. And I was like, well, like, he lived out as a man and he went into this feminine space. Because for us, like, we have, like, our word for womb is whare tangata, like, the house of people. And lots of our creative knowledge, like the whare tangata is like, it's a void. It's like a void of potential. It's like a liminal space. It's like a thought space that exists, but it doesn't exist. It's a space where nothingness turns into something. But it's a feminine space. And I was like, well, what happens when a masculine person encounters death, and a type of death, and in doing so enters into a feminine space? What is the potential of after that? And so that got me into my PhD research, where I started to think about tricksterism, and I started to think about weaving, and I started to think about identity, and I started to think about trauma, and I started to think about what happens after trauma. And it's like, well, what kinds of lessons do tricksters have for us about trauma? Like, we all live with trauma, and it's debilitating. But at the same time, trauma isn't just a negative space. Trauma is also a positive space, because in my own trauma, I had to conceal and blend a whole lot of things in order to make sense of reality. But from that, lots of positive things came, lots of knowing came, lots of being able to talk through trauma came, lots of being able to support other people in my lives who are experiencing similar things came. Lots of really, 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 really positive things came from trauma. I was like, well, actually, there's something about being a trickster that enables a person to expose a trauma and heal it. And so, like, last year, in about July, like my younger brother, you know, like most young men these days, you know, he has, like most young Native men these days, lots of issues, lots of loss. I mean, I can identify with that. And one of the ways that he dealt with his loss was similar to me, different drugs, like drugs that made him really, really angry and really, really aggressive. And my younger brother, like, he's a beautiful boy, like, he's Samoan. So he, you know, like, growing up in a Maori community where you're still Maori because you're from Polynesia, but you're not Maori. You know, that affected him quite seriously. And it got to the point last year where, like, I was like, my younger brother, you know, he's, like, Samoans are big people, and my younger brother, he's tough. He's a real gangster, and he's like that. He's always been like the alpha male of our village. But it got to the point where it was like, actually, I can't let this go on. I can't let his alpha male behaviours and his addictions affect the lives of my nephews and nieces the way it does. And I can't allow this aggression and this anger to manifest in ways that might hurt the kids, or might hurt my mother, or might hurt my sisters. And so he had a go at me, and we had a fight. And I'm quite a shy and quiet person, but my feminine side is tough as. Like, I'm a hearty bitch. And my younger brother was really, really surprised. Surprised to the extent that he was quite proud, and would talk to my nephews and say, oh, your uncle, he's the man. He's the man, he's tough. And around about the same time, my best friend, who'd also, like, he's a Mozzie. Mozzie's like a Maori Aussies, like, he was raised over this side of the ditch. You know, he had experienced similar kinds of things to me, except he's straight. But his sexuality, like, even though we have different sexual preferences and, like, ways of engaging in the world, like, same issues. And he was experiencing some of his issues at the time, and like, even though he doesn't live in our village, he is most definitely the alpha male of our tribe. Like, he is, he's like handsome, debonair, incredibly creative, and quite well known too, not just at home but internationally. He has quite good celebrity status, and he was being out of it, and I had to bitch up again. And those two experiences, like one experience of like hammering my best mate with reality, hammering my younger brother with my fists, like in the space of a week, I changed from being like a transgendered person who was more on the feminine side of the spectrum, because I would always wear makeup, like, and lots of bling, and like it was more like gender fuck, like I really embraced the masculine aspects of myself to the extent that I exuded femininity. And I know that's a real contradiction, but actually it was my masculinity. It was like my fabulous legs and my sexy male body that actually like hyped up the femininity that I was able to portray. But in that week of fighting, something happened, and like I stopped shaving, and I stopped wearing makeup, and I stopped wearing jewelry. And like one day I went to like a research gathering with friends, and they were like, "Tawhanga, you're different." And I was like, "Yeah, I know." Like, and they're like, no, it's not just how you look. Like, you're different. You're being different. Like, you're being quiet. You're being like really subdued. Like, normally what you do, like when we put a theory out there or a question, you're like, "Oh my God!" Like creative brains like this. Oh, what about this idea? What about that idea? I'm like, but you're not being like that. You're being different. Like, what's going on? I was like, actually, I think what's going on is that, like, my feminine side is tough and loud and vocal and proud and really socially dexterous, but my masculine side is really shy and quiet and thoughtful. Like, I think like my creative side, my art making side is my feminine side, like my theory writing side is my masculine side. And when my mates were like, "You're being quiet," I was like, oh my God, like physically I've turned into a man and my brain switched over. Now I can't think like a woman anymore. And so over the past 6 months, I've been like, okay, I can think like a woman because it's in there. Like, I need to do something with the way that I've embodied my gender to enable myself to be, what's the word trannies always use? To be in stealth mode. Like, this is my stealth mode. This is my stealth mode. Actually, being masculine has opened up so many doors that I didn't know existed. Like, being a man, like, I've never been able to say I'm a man before, but like all of a sudden, I'm a man and I'm a hot man too. Like, you know, I've never been able to say stuff like that before because gender dysmorphia that comes with like being transgendered. It's like, it doesn't matter if you've got a hot body or you look great and you train all the time, like, you feel disgusting because you don't have the bits that you think you should have. And yet in the space of a week, all of a sudden that wasn't there anymore. All of a sudden I was like, oh my God, like, I'm a man, and you know what? I'm going to stop shaving my body, and I'm going to grow all my body hair back because I'm really hairy and like hair's in at the moment, and I totally did. And so like transgendered people, like, we are tricksters in so many ways because not only are we able to morph ourselves and shift between gendered realities, we're also able to use the ways we shift to shift the spaces that we occupy. And so I noticed actually, like when I started to take on more masculine traits, I was like, actually, I need to be a man at the moment in my community because all my nephews, like, you know, they're 15, like between 15 and 20 now. Like, there are no other men in my village. Like, it's got to be me. Like, I'm the oldest, and if it's not me, then it's no one. And if it's no one, then they're fucked. And I was like, okay, well, in some ways I'm responding to what's going on up here, but I'm also responding to the physical things that are happening around me. Like, shape-shifting through gender enables me to empower myself, but it also helps me to shape-shift and find out the things that are hidden in my communities. You know, like transgendered people often, I think, from an outside perspective, are seen as hiding things away. Like, you see a tranny and you're like, she's hiding something down there. Underneath that makeup, she's hiding bad skin. Like, Dee said earlier today we were looking at a photo of Beyonce just when we first sat down, and she's like, oh, so these photos of Beyonce just came out and like they show her real skin and people are like really talking about it. But you know, like when she's got makeup on and she showed two images, just like, that's the power of makeup. I was like, I love that, the power of makeup. The power of makeup, the power of not just makeup, like applying a foundation and applying lipstick and applying eyeshadow and applying eyeliner and applying mascara and applying all of these things, these clothes. Makeup isn't just about application, makeup is about making up, filling things in, filling spaces. So, if I'm a transgendered person and I'm able to use my ability to shift gender to affect the way that I think about myself, and if I'm also able to use the ways that I am fluid with my gender to also manifest different realities around me, how am I doing that? What is the process? What is the physical process of that happening? And like, I was like, actually, that's like weaving. That's just like weaving. Like, if you take things that come from opposite directions and you join them together, like something happens. Like two things that are units or strands, you join them together, they form an object. They have form, they have resonance, they have a capacity to hold something, they have a capacity to be filled. And I thought about like that heaps, and I thought, well, actually, you know, raranga or weaving is like it's like a really, really kind of trans. It's kind of a really, really trans process. Like I made a comment earlier, in two of the earlier presentations around my interest in media as being a trans space, and really that's what happens when you're an artist and you create. You're putting something of yourself in a space for somebody over here to take. Like that's a transitory space. And I was like, actually, you know, like raranga is like the most foundational, weaving is the most foundational practice that we have. Like in our culture, like we really celebrate carving, we really celebrate painting, but it's only been since like maybe the 60s that we've started to celebrate weaving again. But actually, what I feel like we've been doing is we've been going through a decolonization process in our art forms. And it started with the things that are most surface, the most on the, that not are superficial, but are, that are easy to contend with. We've started going down to the depths of our creative practices. And right at the very base level is raranga. Because if you can't weave, you can't clothe yourself. If you can't weave, you can't make a house. If you can't do those things, then you die. Simple as that. Forget about carving. Yes, carving is beautiful, but you don't need to carve to clothe yourself. Yes, painting is beautiful. Yes, tāmoko is beautiful, but you don't need those things. Weaving is fundamental. And I was like, well, actually, that's really, really interesting, because here at our deepest foundations of our creative practices are trannies. Trannies, this trans space. In this trans space, we are taking oppositional things, joining them together, and like form happens in that trans space. But actually, if you're a weaver, you know that it's not the form that holds it together, it's the spaces in between. Because if you can't weave and regulate your tension, if you can't regulate the spaces, the voids, then actually you have a potato, that's what you have. You have a potato, you don't have a woven object, you've got a potato, you've got something that, well, yeah, I did it, it's really cool, but it's not beautiful. And so I started to think, wow, like actually, raranga is really, really special. And I get raranga in a hard out way because it's a trans practice. And you know, like what makes raranga a trans practice is that like there are two types of weaving in Te Ao Māori and Māori culture. And one is raranga, and that's what I do. And with raranga, you use the surface of the Harakeke leaf, the surface of the leaf to weave. The other form is whatu. And with whatu, you strip away the outside and you work with the inside. So that's one like binary, like the inside and outside. And like I said before, you create a form, but weavers know that actually it's not the form, it's what the form can hold that's important, it's what you can't see that's important. Yes, the object, you need the object to hold something, but unless you have that object, nothing can be held. So another binary space. And then I thought about, okay, what do we weave? In our home in Aotearoa, we call it flax, but it's not flax. It's actually, it's a type of grass, it's a lily. And in Aotearoa, it grows about this big. Like, the leaves are really, really long. Like, we just got a perfect climate for this plant that grows like this big everywhere else in the world. And like, we call it flax, but actually it's called Harakeke. And at the base of at the foundation of our culture, we have a concept called the pā Harakeke. And the pā Harakeke is like, pā is like a village, and Harakeke is like the plant. So it's like the village of this plant. It's like the flax plantation. And within this concept of te pā Harakeke, it can be the flax plantation or it can be about family. And so like with a Harakeke plant, they grow in fans like this. So at the center of a fan, you've got te rito. And te rito is the baby. But, you know, like, if you've just got a baby, if you've just got a baby, then like the baby's going to die. So the baby needs something. The baby needs parents. And so either side of the baby, either side of te rito is ngā matua. You've got the parents, or leaves that occupy the space of parents, that embrace that baby to keep it safe. But without the baby, well, what good are the parents? Like, they don't function. So you need those 3 leaves. Like, those 3 leaves are quite central to the existence of the bush. And if you cut away the centre leaf, the rest of the plant will die. If you cut away these leaves, the plant will die. So those 3 leaves always stay. Then either side of that, you've got grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we do when we weave, like, we take the grandparents, and that's a beautiful analogy because it's like, well, you know, grandparents have served their purpose, like they've looked after us, and they have another unique journey that we can't see. And so as weavers, we take the grandparents of the plant, and we cut them away from the plant, and that helps the plant be aerated and to thrive because there's more nutrient. But at the same time, we take the grandparents and we turn them into beautiful objects. We turn them into beautiful clothes. We turn them into beautiful art objects. We turn them into things that have meaning. And I was like, well, like, actually, like, te pā Harakeke, and my relationship with it, it's been like, almost like I've needed to start with my ancestors, my tupuna, the ancestors that I didn't know, start from the outside of the plant, figure them out. I got them, I know who they are. I know that they had a vision for me. I think Karina Walters said it like at a seminar last year, you know, yes, we can think about historical trauma and like the kinds of negative ways that we're used to talking about and thinking about historical trauma, or we can think about the vision of hope that our ancestors had for us and experiencing that trauma. And I'm like, you know, I didn't know my ancestors, but they had a vision of who I was and what they wanted for my life. And me engaging with that helped me get past some barriers. And then like after that came my parents, like really figuring out, you know, it doesn't matter that actually I was adopted and that for a long time I didn't feel like I was part of the family because they really loved me, and I could never deny that they loved me because they took me. They said, we want that one. Nobody wants him, we want him. And they took me, and so I couldn't deny that. And so I problem solved that, and I was like, okay, well, I've got those relationships. And like in the Harakeke plant, you get these other leaves growing out too. And they come out of the side, like they don't happen all the time, but I was like, oh, those are my siblings too, you know. So I sorted out my sibling relationships, and then I was like, oh my God, I think I need to sort myself out. And so through my PhD project, I've been like, wow, I've gotten to the point where I actually feel like I have sorted myself out to the extent that I feel really decolonized, like so decolonized on so many levels that like I didn't think possible. But now I'm like, okay, well, what happens? Like, I'm decolonized, that's really, really awesome, and I feel really, really good about it. But then what? Like, what good is being decolonized if you can't use it? So then from that, I've been like, you know, my siblings, I love my sisters and my brother, and I love their kids. And it's been like, okay, well, what can I do for my sister? What can I do for my big sister to help support her through the abuses that she's engaged in her life? What can I do for my younger sister to support her in the kinds of abuses and traumas that she's experienced? What can I do for my younger brother to help him? And then it's like, okay, well, our siblings, we're sorted. Like in our generation, we're starting to do really awesome things. And it's like, okay, well, I don't want my mother to die with the emptiness that she's lived with her whole life from being a person of Welsh descent living in a Māori village. As a Welsh person, she's had to deal with her own colonisation and the ways that she might be perceived as a coloniser, even though, from my perspective, my white mother is the most Māori person in our village. And for us, Māori, we use Māori as an ethnic identifier or as an identifier of those are Māori people. But actually in our language, Māori just means normal and ordinary. And I had a really interesting kōrero or conversation with my cousin, and she was like, oh, if you take that word apart, it means pure harmony. And I was like, oh, pure harmony, that's like holism. Actually a Māori way of thinking. Lots of people think in holistic ways. So is Māori really about race? Or is Māori about a way of thinking, an inclusive way of thinking, a way of thinking that combine things together? And so I'm like, well, if I occupy this in-between space that is able to decolonize and then start to do something to transform my community, not my community, but my family, and then my community, I need to theorize about that. But as an artist, I'm like, theory isn't just about thinking. Theory is also about doing. Theory exists in objects. Theory exists in forms. Theory exists in space. Theory exists in all these really intangible ways that we feel and connect to in quite emotive ways. That's the theory. When you feel happy, that's the theory. When you have an emotional response to are those fake flowers or are they real? But when you have an emotional response to those flowers, it's a theory, and maybe we can't read it like a book, and maybe we can't reference it in the same way, but it's a theory all the same because it has a function. You don't just experience happiness for the sake of it. You experience happiness because it functions in a particular kind of way. It functions to empower you. It functions to affect your hormones, to make you do extraordinary things and feel good about yourself. So I'm like, well, if rāranga is this in-between space, what is the in-between space of creative knowledge and logical knowledge? I'm a weaver, and I know that weaving is about theory, and I also know that it's about creative practices. Well, maybe what I'm doing can help transform the institution that I study in, because the institution that I study in at Waikato University in Kirikiriroa in Aotearoa, it's a really, really staunch Māori university. And some days it's spot the white person, it really is. It's a really brown institution, and everyone speaks te reo Māori. I don't speak my language very well, I can barely understand it sometimes. But doesn't matter. My friends will always be blah, 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 and I'll be like, I got one word out of that. But it doesn't matter because it's really, really staunchly Māori. But the staunchly Māori institution has been we need something. We've got all this beautiful Māori theory, but something is missing. And so about the time that I was looking to do my PhD, someone said to me, look at Waikato. And I was like, they don't. I don't want to do an education PhD. I need to do something about fine arts. That's where I'm at. And around about the same time, the institution were like, you know what, we're developing a creative practice PhD program, and talk to us. And so I did, I talked to them. And they talked back and they're like, oh, actually we've got this barrier, this institutional barrier, this bureaucracy. So I talked back to them. I was like, yeah, well, you better sort that stuff out. You want this program, I'm saying, I can do it. I know this stuff. Come on, take me on. And constant dialogue, creating a relationship. And through that relationship, ta-da, first creative practice PhD student at Waikato. Now there are two more. My friend Donna, who was my mentor, my rāranga tutor, I'm studying rāranga, I'm theorising rāranga, not just the practice of rāranga, but the theory of rāranga. She's theorising whatu, the inside of the plant. And so we're doing, these two, that's inside and outside of the same kind of process. And the institution are wow, you're allowed to think like that. When we talk about our ideas and people have questions, they're like, oh, well, what about this theory? We're like, oh, well, well, how do you think like that? It's hey, all artists think like that. That's how creative people think. We don't think in these boxes, we think outside of them. But actually being able to think in boxes is really important too. You need to be able to think inside of a box as well as outside of it. Being colonised, even though we talk about colonisation in really, really bad ways, for me, like decolonizing methodologies just doesn't just decolonize us from the colonialisms that have come from Europe. What about the colonialisms that we have been enacting on each other? Like, there are lots of instances today where Māori knowledge is filling other Indigenous spaces where voids have been created through colonialism. Like, how is not what Māori theorists are doing a form of colonialism too? And how has Māori migration through the Pacific, how has that not been a form of colonization? So it's like, actually you need to experience things from the inside to understand how they work from the outside too. Like, you need that inside and outside. You need that trans space, because if you don't have that trans space, you have one thing or the other. Around about the time I turned into a man, actually it was the same day that my friends pointed out to me, you're different. We were at a wānanga, or a learning workshop, and it was on like quantitative methodologies. And I was like, I kind of felt like I'd been funded, so I went, because it's what you do. But I was like, numbers, like that kind of theory has been used to tear us apart. I don't want to know about their methodology. It's all numbers. I don't know numbers. I don't understand that. I don't understand how to take a data set and turn it into something the ways that statisticians do it. But then over the day, like, people started talking, and I started hearing the story about, I started hearing about quantitative methods from a Māori perspective, and I was like, hold on, like, here I am telling myself I don't know numbers. I'm a weaver. Like, you can't weave if you're not good at maths. If you're not good at maths, you can't weave, because like the kinds of patterns that happen in weaving, if you're weaving them with your hands and you're trying to work out the algorithms and the maths involved to get the geometry that you want, it's impossible. Like, you can't think. You have to rely on your body to know that the pattern is working, to know that the pattern will work, to know that what you visualize in your mind will happen. So you have to let go of the intense kind of concrete theory to let the actual theory happen. And I was like, actually, like, not only do I understand numbers and pattern, as a weaver, I also know how to change a pattern. Like, when you weave something, if you want to have a pattern in it, that pattern has to go in at the very start. Like, you prep your material, and then when you put it together, when you put your strands together, at that point you say, this is what my pattern is going to be. You make a very affirmative decision about what the vision you see for your object, or the future of this thing that you're nurturing. You have to put that in at the start. You have to do it with intent. But if you're a really, really skilled weaver, you can change a pattern. It's not easy. What it takes is focus. It takes being able to be immersed in your work and to be able to stand back and go, well, I do like that pattern, but actually I want it to go that way now. Or I like it, but now I want it to disappear. Or I like it, but I want to turn it into something else. You have to be quite switched on to do that. So actually, like, when I figured that out, I was like, actually, I really, really do know qualitative methods. And because of the ways that I've understood how to learn, and because of the kind of binaries that we get forced upon us, this is scientific knowledge. You creatives go over there. Because of those kind of binaries, I couldn't see that actually there is a really, really clear relationship between qualitative methods and quantitative methods. Because without being able to work with those numbers, it's really difficult to tell, like, when you work with those numbers, like, what is the purpose of working with numbers and statistical data sets? To tell a particular story. So it's actually all about story. Like, theory is all about story. Like, what is an academic essay but a story, just in a more concrete way? And so there is a very, very clear relationship between quantitative data and qualitative data. And actually, like, for me, Indigenous creative practices, they help emphasize that. If you're able to look at it in this kind of dual kind of way, this fluid bound kind of way, or not bound, but intersecting kind of way. So that makes me think, like, and you know what, I'm going to show you an image. Nope. Oh, what am I talking? So I'm like, I'm a really, really colonised person who was able to do something to help myself decolonise and help my community decolonise. And I'm still doing that work and I love that work. But what about people who aren't in my community? Like, I got white friends. I know white people. And I love them. Like my non-Māori friends who are white, who have descent lines from England or ascent lines from England or ascent lines from Scandinavia or ascent lines from Germany. Like we relate to each other in really, really positive ways. And that's one of the beautiful things that I love about Aotearoa is that even though like there is this friction that happens all the time, there is this beautiful space in between. Like when we're able to get past the frictions and the traumas and the tensions, there's a really, really positive space and beautiful things come out of Aotearoa, this tiny place at the bottom of the world. Really, really, like magic happens there, like really, really powerful things happen there. And so it's made me start thinking, well, actually, what is the in-between space of Indigenous theory and Western theory? Like how are we able to use Western theories to theorize from our own perspectives? And like, Linda Tuhiwai Smith is really, really upfront about the ways that Frantz Fanon and Freire influenced her thinking. So like, what I've started to really understand is that actually Western theory, while it has been used to define us and used to other us and it has been used to objectify us, actually like, if we develop those theories a bit more, if we take apart these Western theories and really, really delve into them, well, what do we find but Indigenous theory? Like if we really, really start to unpack Western theory, then we empower it by making it Indigenous. And so I want to leave you with this image, and a question that I asked you at the beginning, here we are in an academic institution, a learning space, and we're theorising all of the time, and we're listening to theory, we're reading theory, we're engaging with theory. What is that theory for? If you love theory so much, how are you using theory? If you love theory so much, what is the vision for the future that theory is creating for you? And so on that note, I'd just like to say thank you again, and I wish you well on your journeys. Kia ora.